reading room. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. I am here on day 355. Look at our new sign. It says welcome. Look at our new setup that we have here. So displaying my artsy craftiness. And we are here in the reading room. Oh, I don't know why I have reading room Tuesdays. Are we reading something else? Oh, we're reading Trevor Noah on Thursday. I haven't checked to see where that package is. It was supposed to be here yesterday. It, whatever. And then it's just dangling there for some place in, outer space over there in Farmington Hills. And then, in Allen something or other, Allen Park, Michigan. So just really floating around right over here. God knows why they can't get it delivered. But anyway, that's where we're at in our usual suspenseful mode about what is going on with everything. I'm going to start the chapter over, which I only got into a page anyway. And this is chapter 3. And this is actually we're going to call it day 3. I don't know why we would call it day 4. We're really not on day 4. So let's get that changed right now. And then we will get into Chapter 3 of A Case for Christ from Lee Strobel. There we go. Day 3. Chapter 3, the documentary evidence. I just want you to know, in my spare time, I'm also reading A Case for Faith, The Case for Faith by Lee Strobel, and it also is a page turner. I am just turning these pages like it is a bestseller mystery novel. It's good. He is a good writer. And I get his interviewing techniques. He at first was like a bull in a china shop. And that's how I could be too, right? Making sure you understand just the facts, ma'am, right? And then he just backs off and lets his experts take control. And he's just a great writer. So the documentary evidence, were Jesus's biographies reliably preserved for us, chapter 3. As a reporter at the Chicago Tribune, I was a document rat. I spent countless hours rummaging through court files and sniffing for tidbits of news. It was painstaking and time-consuming, but the rewards were worth it. I managed to scoop the competition with front-page stories on a regular basis. For example, I once stumbled upon some top-secret grand jury transcripts that had inadvertently been put in a public file. My subsequent articles exposed massive bid rigging behind some of Chicago's biggest public works projects, including the construction of major expressways. But the most eye-popping cache of documents I ever uncovered came in a landmark case in which Ford Motor Company was charged with reckless homicide for their fiery deaths of 3 teenagers in a subcompact Pinto. I remember this. It was the first time, because I took a Pinto to Florida. It was the first time a U.S. manufacturer had been criminally charged for allegedly marketing a dangerous product. When I checked the court file in tiny Winnemac, Indiana, I found scores of confidential Ford memos revealing that the automaker knew in advance that the Pinto would explode when struck from behind at about 20 miles an hour. The documents indicated that the automaker decided against improving the car's safety to save a few dollars per vehicle and to increase its luggage space. Now that was part of their commercial, right? A small car with big luggage space. So I could see why they wouldn't want to change all of the commercial industry, but it still seems like there's more to the story than that, doesn't it? Like a big, who's buying this car anyway? A Ford lawyer who happened to be strolling through the courthouse spotted me making photocopies of the documents. Frantically, he rushed into court to get a judicial order sealing the file from the public's view. But it was too late. My story headline, Ford ignored Pinto fire peril, secret memo show, was bannered in the Tribune and then flashed throughout the country. Authenticating the documents, obtaining secret corporate memos is one thing. Verifying their authenticity is another. Before journalists can publish their contents or a prosecutor can admit the documents as evidence in a trial, steps must be taken to make sure they're genuine. Concerning the so-called Pinto papers, could the Ford letterheads on which they were written be counterfeits? Could the signatures be forgeries? How could I know for sure? And since the memos had obviously been photocopied numerous times, how could I be confident that their contents hadn't been tampered with? In other words, how could I be certain that each copied document was identical to the original memo, which I didn't possess? What's more, how could I be positive that these memos told the whole story? After all, they represented just a small fraction of the internal correspondence at Ford. What if there were other memos still hidden from the public's view that would shed a whole different light on the matter if they were revealed? These are significant questions, and they're equally relevant in examining the New Testament. When I hold a Bible in my hands, essentially I'm holding copies of ancient historical records, the original manuscripts of the biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and all the other books of the Old and New Testaments have long ago crumbled into dust. So how can I be sure that these modern day versions, the end product of countless copying throughout the ages, bear any resemblance to what the authors originally wrote? In addition, how can I tell if these 4 biographies are telling the whole story? What if there were other biographies of Jesus that have been censored because the early church didn't like the image of Jesus they portrayed? How could I have confidence that church politics haven't squelched biographies of Jesus that were every bit as accurate as the 4 that were finally included in the New Testament and that would shed important new light on the words and deeds of this controversial carpenter from Nazareth? These 2 issues, whether Jesus' biographies were reliably preserved for us and whether equally accurate biographies have been suppressed by the church, merited careful consideration. I knew that there was once one scholar universally recognized as a leading authority on these matters. I flew to Newark and drove a rental car to Princeton to visit him on short notice. The second interview, Bruce M. Metzger, Ph.D. I found 84-year-old Bruce Metzger on a Saturday afternoon at his usual hangout, the library at Princeton Theological Seminary, where he said with a smile, "I like to dust off the books." Actually, he has written some of the best of them, especially when the topic is the text of the New Testament. In all, he has authored or edited 50 books, including the New Testament, its background growth and content, the text of the New Testament, the canon of the New Testament, manuscripts of the Greek Bible, textual commentary on the Greek New Testament, introduction to the Apocrypha, and the Oxford Companion to the Bible. I have that. Several have been translated into German, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Malagasy, and other languages. He also is co-editor of the New Oxford Annotated Bible with the Apocrypha and general editor of more than 25 volumes in the series New Testament Tools and Studies. Metzger's education includes a master's degree from Princeton Theological Seminary and both a master's and a doctorate from Princeton University. He has been awarded honorary doctorates by 5 colleges and universities, including St. Andrews University in Scotland, the University of Munster in Germany, and Potchefstroom University in South Africa. Where are my honorary doctorates? What was that? I haven't written books. Hey, listen, this is an encyclopedia filled with information. In 1969, he served as resident scholar at Tyndale at Tyndale House, Cambridge, England. He was a visiting fellow at Clare Hall, University of Cambridge in 1974 and at Wolfson College, Oxford in 1979. He is currently professor emeritus at Princeton Theological Seminary after a 46-year career teaching the New Testament. Metzger is a chairman of the New Revised Standard Version Bible Committee, a corresponding fellow of the British Academy, and serves on the curatorium of the Vetus Latina Institute at the Monastery of Buron, Germany. He is past president of the Society of Biblical Literature, the International Society for New Testament Studies, and the North American Patristic Society. If you scan the footnotes of any authoritative book on the text of the New Testament, the odds are you're going to see Metzger cited time after time. His books are mandatory reading in universities and seminaries around the world. He is held in the highest regard by scholars from across a wide range of theological beliefs. In many ways, Metzger, born in 1914, is a throwback to an earlier generation. Alighting from a gray Buick he calls my gas buggy, he is wearing a dark gray suit and blue paisley tie, which is about as casual as he gets during his visits to the library, even on a weekend. His white hair is neatly combed, his eyes bright and alert, are framed by rimless glasses. He walks slower than he used to, but he has no difficulty methodically climbing the stairs to the second floor, where he conducts his research in an obscure and austere office. And he hasn't lost his sense of humor. He showed me a tin canister he inherited as chairman of the Revised Standard Version Bible Committee. He opened the lid to reveal the ashes of an RSV Bible that had been torched in 1952 bonfire during a protest by a fundamentalist preacher. It seems he didn't like it when the committee changed fellows of the King James Version to comrades in Hebrew 1:9. Metzger explained with a chuckle. He accused them of being communists. Though Metzger's speech is hesitant at times, and he's prone to replying in quaint phrases like, "quite so," he continues to remain on the cutting edge of New Testament scholarship. When I asked for some statistics, he didn't rely on the numbers in his 1992 book on the New Testament. He had conducted fresh research to get up-to-date figures. His quick mind has no problem recalling details of people and places, and he's fully conversant with all the current debates among New Testament experts. In fact, they continue to look to him for insight and wisdom. His office is about the size of a jail cell, is windowless and painted institutional gray. It has 2 wooden chairs. He insisted I take the more comfortable one. That was part of his charm. He was thoroughly kind, surprisingly modest, and self-effacing, with a gentle spirit that made me want to someday grow old with the same mellow kind of grace. We got acquainted with each other for a while, and then I turned to the first issue I wanted to address. How can we be sure the biographies of Jesus were handed down to us in a reliable way? Now, I just want to look at this. So, this is copyrighted in 1998. So you take 15 years off of that. He's 85 years old here, Metzger. Copies of copies. I'll be honest with you, I said to Metzger. When I first found out that there are no surviving originals of the New Testament, I was really skeptical. I thought, if all we have are copies of copies of copies, how can I have any confidence that the New Testament we have today bears any resemblance whatsoever to what was originally written? How do you respond to that? This isn't an issue that's unique to the Bible. It's a question we can ask of other documents that have come down to us from antiquity, he replied. But what the New Testament has in its favor, especially when compared with other ancient writings, is the unprecedented multiplicity of copies that have survived. Why is that important, I asked? Well, the more often you have copies that agree with each other, especially if they emerge from different geographical areas, the more you can cross-check them to figure out what the original document was like. The only way they'd agreed would be where they went back genealogically in a family tree that represents the descent of the manuscripts. Okay, I said, I can see that having a lot of copies from various places can help. Well, what about the age of the documents? Certainly that's important as well, isn't it? Quite so, he replied. And this is something else that favors the New Testament. We have copies commencing within a couple of generations from the writing of the originals, whereas in the case of other ancient texts, maybe 5, 8, or 10 centuries elapsed between the original and the earliest surviving copy. In addition to Greek manuscripts, we also have translations of the Gospels into other languages at a relatively early time, into Latin, Syriac, and Coptic. Let me close that door. Those sirens are the most ridiculous things. They'll come close, then they'll get further away, then they'll get close, then they'll just come close, die, and die out. Ridiculous. As I've said, no emergencies here. Just a lot of people on government funding looking like there is. Hey, you guys, we don't know what to do. Let's go drive around with a siren on. In addition to Greek manuscripts, we also have translations of the Gospels into other languages, I already said that, at a relatively early time, into Latin, Syriac, and Coptic. And beyond that, we have what may be called secondary translations made a little later, the Armenian, like Armenian and Gothic, and a lot of others, Georgian, Ethiopic, a great variety. That's amazing to me. That's amazing that early on, Coptic isn't even a language anymore, yet the Bible was translated into Coptic. Georgian, that was in Russia. That used to be in Russia. Ethiopic, what was the necessity or importance in translating that in an Ethiopian language? So interesting how they would have what? Desired that? Having a transcript of the Bible? That's so interesting to me. How does that help? Because even if we had no Greek manuscripts today, by piecing together the information from these translations from a relatively early date, we could actually reproduce the contents of the New Testament. In addition to that, even if we lost all the Greek manuscripts and the early translations, we could still reproduce the contents of the New Testament from the multiplicity of quotations in commentaries, sermon letters, and so forth of the early church fathers. While that seemed impressive, it was difficult to judge this evidence in isolation. I needed some context to better appreciate the uniqueness of the New Testament. How, I wondered, did it compare with other well-known works of antiquity? A mountain of manuscripts. When you talk about a great multiplicity of manuscripts, I said, how does that contrast with other ancient books that are routinely accepted by scholars as being reliable? For instance, tell me about the writing of authors from about the time of Jesus. Having anticipated the question, Metzger referred to some handwritten notes he had brought along. Consider Tacitus, the Roman historian who wrote his Annals of Imperial Rome in about 116 AD. He began. His first 6 books exist today in only one manuscript, and it was copied about 850 AD. Books 11 through 16 are in another manuscript dating from the 11th century. Books 7 through 10 are lost. So there is a long gap between the time that Tacitus sought his information and wrote it down and the only existing copies. So from 116 he wrote it, and 850 is the first copy. With regard to the first century historian Josephus, we have 9 Greek manuscripts of his work, the Jewish War, and these copies were written in the 10th, 11th, and 12th century. There is a Latin translation from the 4th century and medieval Russian materials from the 11th or 12th century. Those numbers were surprising. There is but the thinnest thread of manuscripts connecting these ancient works to the modern world. By comparison, I ask, how many New Testament Greek manuscripts are in existence today? Metzger's eyes got wide. More than 5,000 have been cataloged, he said with enthusiasm, his voice going up an octave. That was a mountain of manuscripts compared to the anthills of Tacitus and Josephus. Is that unusual in the ancient world? What would be the runner-up, I asked. The quantity of New Testament material is almost embarrassing in comparison with other works of antiquity, he said. Next to the New Testament, the greatest amount of manuscript testimony is of Homer's Iliad, which was the Bible of the ancient Greeks. There are fewer than 650 Greek manuscripts of it today. There are some fragmentary. Some are quite fragmentary. They come down to us from the 2nd and 3rd century AD and following. When you consider that Homer composed his epic about 800 BC, you can see there's a very lengthy gap. Very lengthy was an understatement. It was 1,000 years. There was in fact no comparison. The manuscript evidence for the New Testament was overwhelming when juxtaposed against other revered writings of antiquity. Work with modern scholars have absolutely no reluctance treating as authentic. My curiosity about the New Testament manuscripts have been piqued. I asked Metzger to describe some of them for me. The earliest are fragments of papyrus, which was a writing material made from the papyrus plant that grew in the marshes of the Nile Delta in Egypt, he said. There are now 99 fragmentary pieces of papyrus that contain one or more passages or books of the New Testament. The most significant to come to light are the Chester Beatty biblical papyri discovered about 1930. Of these, Beatty biblical papyrus number 1 contains portions of the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts, and it dates from the 3rd century. Papyrus number 2 contains large portions of 8 letters of Paul, plus portions of Hebrews, dating to about the year 200. Papyrus number 3 has a sizable section of the book of Revelation dating from the 3rd century. Another group of important papyrus manuscripts was purchased by a Swiss bibliophile, M. Martin Bodmer. The earliest of these, dating from about 200, contains about 2/3 of the Gospel of John. Another papyrus containing portions of the Gospel of Luke and John dates from the 3rd century. At this point, the gap between the writing of the biographies of Jesus and the earliest manuscript was extremely small. But what is the oldest manuscript we possess? How close in time, I wondered, can we get to the original writings, which experts call autographs? The scrap that changed history. Of the entire New Testament, I said, what is the earliest portion that we possess today? Metzger didn't have to ponder the answer. That would be a fragment of the Gospel of John, containing material from chapter 18. It has 5 verses, 3 on one side, 2 on the other, and it measures about 2.5 by 3.5 inches, he said. How was it discovered? It was purchased in Egypt as early as 1920, but it sat unnoticed for years among similar fragments of papyri. Then in 1934, C.H. Roberts of St. John's College, Oxford, was sorting through the papyri at the John Rylands Library in Manchester, England. He immediately recognized this as preserving a portion of John's Gospel. He was able to date it from the style of the script. And what was his conclusion, I asked? How far back does it go? He concluded it originated between 100 and 150 AD. Lots of other prominent paleographers like Sir Frederick Kenyon, Sir Harold Bell, Adolf Deisman, W.H.P. Hatch, Ulrich Wilken, and others have agreed with his assessment. Deisman was convinced that it goes back at least to the reign of Emperor Hadrian, which was 117 to 138 AD, or even Emperor Trajan, which was 98 to 117 AD. This was a stunning discovery. The reason skeptical German theologians in the last century argued strenuously that the fourth gospel was not even composed until at least the year 160, too distant from the events of Jesus' life to be much historical use. They were able to influence generations of scholars who scoffed at the gospel's reliability. This certainly blows that opinion out of the water, I commented. Yes, it does, he said. Here we have at a very early date a fragment of a copy of John all the way over in a community along the Nile River in Egypt, far from Ephesus in Asia Minor, where the gospel was probably originally composed. This finding has literally rewritten popular views of history, pushing the composition of John's gospel much closer to the days when Jesus walked the earth. I made a mental note to check with an archaeologist about whether any other findings have bolstered the confidence we can have in the fourth gospel. A wealth of evidence. While papyrus manuscripts represent the earliest copies of the New Testament, there are also ancient copies written on parchment, which was made from the skins of cattle, sheep, goats, and antelope. We have what are called uncial manuscripts, which are written in all capital Greek letters, Metzger explained. Today we have 306 of these, several dating back as early as the 3rd century. The most important are Codex Sinaiticus, which is the only complete New Testament in uncial letters, and Codex Vaticanus, which is not quite complete. Both date to about 350 AD. I've said to you before, I've looked at the history of that. There are 3 2-hour videos that are out there. And if you look at the history of the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, you'll see the fight that took place to substantiate these versions of the Bible. A new style of writing, more cursive in nature, emerged in roughly 800 AD. It's called minuscule, and we have 2,856 of these manuscripts. Then there are also lectionaries, which contain New Testament scripture in the sequence it was to be read in the early churches at appropriate times during the year. A total of 2,403 of these have been cataloged. That puts the grand total of Greek manuscripts at 5,664. In addition to the Greek documents, he said, there are thousands of other ancient New Testament manuscripts in other languages. There are 8,000 to 10,000 Latin Vulgate manuscripts, plus a total of 8,000 in Ethiopic, Slavic, and Armenian. In all, there are about 24,000 manuscripts in existence. What's your opinion then, I asked, wanting to confirm clearly what I thought I was hearing him say. In terms of the multiplicity of manuscripts and the time gap between the originals and our first copies, how does the New Testament stack up against other well-known works of antiquity? Extremely well, he replied. We can have great confidence in the fidelity with which the material has come down to us, especially compared with any other ancient literary work. That conclusion is shared by distinguished scholars throughout the world, said the late F.F. Bruce, eminent professor at the University of Manchester, England, and the author of The New Testament Documents. Are they reliable? There is nobody of ancient literature in the world which enjoys such a wealth of good textual attestation as the New Testament. Metzger had already mentioned the name of Sir Frederick Kenyon, former director of the British Museum and author of the Paleography of Greek Papyri. Kenyon has said that in no other case is the interval of time between the composition of the book and the date of the earliest manuscript so short as that of the New Testament. His conclusion? The last foundation for any doubt that the scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed. However, what about discrepancies among the various manuscripts? In the days before lightning-fast photocopying machines, manuscripts were laboriously hand-copied by scribes, letter by letter, word by word, line by line, in a process that was ripe for errors. Now I want to zero in on whether these copying mistakes have rendered our modern Bibles hopelessly riddled with inaccuracies. Examining the errors. With the similarities in the way Greek letters are written and with the primitive conditions under which the scribes worked, it would seem inevitable that copying errors could creep into the text, I said. Quite so, Metzger conceded. And in fact, aren't there literally tens of thousands of variations among the ancient manuscripts that we have? Quite so. Doesn't that therefore mean we can't trust them, I asked, sounding more accusatory than inquisitive. No, sir, it does not, Metzger replied firmly. First, let me say this. Eyeglasses weren't invented until 1373 in Venice, and I'm sure that astigmatism existed among the ancient scribes. That was compounded by the fact that it was difficult under any circumstances to read faded manuscripts on which some of the ink had flaked away. And there were other hazards, inattentiveness on the part of the scribes, for example. So yes, although for the most part scribes were scrupulously careful, errors did creep in. I need to get my water over here. And my coffee. I'm trying to drink more water. You should too. So yes, although for the most part scribes were scrupulously careful, errors did creep in. But he was quick to add, there are factors counteracting that. For example, sometimes the scribe's memory would play tricks on him. Between the time it took for him to look at the text and then to write down the words, the order of words might get shifted. He may write down the right words, but in the wrong sequence. This is nothing to be alarmed at because Greek, unlike English, is an inflected language. Meaning, I prompted him. Meaning it makes a whale of a difference in English if you say dog bites man or man bites dog. Sequence matters in English, but in Greek it doesn't. One word functions as the subject of the sentence regardless of where it stands in the sequence. Consequently, the meaning of the sentence isn't distorted if the words are out of what we consider to be the right order. So yes, some variations among manuscripts exist, but generally they are inconsequential variations like that. Differences in spelling would be another example. Still, the high number of variants or differences among manuscripts was troubling. I had some estimates as high as 200,000 of them. However, Metzger downplayed the significance of that figure. The number sounds big, but it's a bit misleading because of the way variants are counted, he said. He explained that if a single word is misspelled in 2,000 manuscripts, that's counted as 2,000 variants. I keyed in on the most important issue. How many doctrines of the church are in jeopardy because of variants? I don't know of any doctrine that is in jeopardy, he responded confidently. None? None, he repeated. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses can't come to our door and say, your Bible is wrong in the King James Version of 1 John chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, when it talks about the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. And these three are one, they'll say. That's not in the earliest manuscripts. And that's true enough. I think that these words are found in only about 7 or 8 copies, all from the 15th or 16th century. I acknowledge that is not part of what the author of 1 John was inspired to write. But that does not dislodge the firmly witnessed testimony of the Bible to the doctrine of the Trinity. At the baptism of Jesus, the Father speaks, his beloved Son is baptized, and the Holy Spirit descends on him. At the ending of 2 Corinthians, Paul says, may the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all. There are many places where the Trinity is represented. So the variations, when they occur, tend to be minor rather than substantive. Yes, that's correct. And scholars work very carefully to try to resolve them by getting back to the original meaning. The more significant variations do not overthrow any doctrine of the church. Any good Bible will have notes that will alert the reader to variant readings of any consequence. But again, these are rare. So rare that scholars Norman Geisler and William Nix conclude, quote, the New Testament, then, has not only survived in more manuscripts than any other book from antiquity, but it has survived in a purer form than any other great book, a form that is 99.5% pure. However, even if it's true that the transmission of the New Testament through history has been unprecedented in its reliability, how do we know that we have the whole picture? What about allegations that the church councils squelched equally legitimate documents because they didn't like the picture of Jesus they portrayed? How do we know that 27 books of the New Testament represent the best and most reliable information? Why is it that our Bibles contain Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but many other Gospels, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of the Egyptians, the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Nativity of Mary, were excluded? It was time to turn to the question of the canon, a term that comes from a Greek word meaning rule, norm, or standard, and that describes the books that have been accepted as official in the church and included in the New Testament. Metzger is considered a leading authority in that field. A high degree of unanimity. How did the early church leaders determine which books would be considered authoritative and which would be discarded, I asked. What criteria did they use in determining which documents would be included in the New Testament? Basically, the early church had 3 criteria, he said. First, the books must have apostolic authority. That is, they must have been written by either the apostles themselves, who were eyewitnesses to what they wrote about, or by followers of the apostles. So in the case of Mark and Luke, while they weren't among the 12 disciples, early traditions has it that Mark was a helper of Peter and Luke was an associate of Paul. I want to highlight that using a highlighter because I don't always remember that. So, Mark was a helper of Peter, and Luke was the doctor for Paul. Second, there was the criterion of conformity to what was called the rule of faith. That is, was the document congruent with the basic Christian tradition that the church recognized as normative? And third, there was the criterion of whether a document had had continuous acceptance and usage by the church at large. They merely applied those criteria and let the chips fall where they may, I asked. Well, it would be accurate to say that these criteria were simply applied in a mechanical fashion, he replied. They were certainly different opinions about which criterion should be given the most weight. But what's remarkable is that even though the fringes of the canon remained unsettled for a while, there was actually a high degree of unanimity concerning the greater part of the New Testament within the first 2 centuries. And this was true among very diverse congregations scattered over a wide area. So I said, the 4 Gospels we have in the New Testament today met those criteria, while others didn't. Yes, he said, it was, if I may put it this way, an example of survival of the fittest. And talking about the canon, Arthur Darby Knock used to tell his students at Harvard, the most traveled roads in Europe are the best roads. That's why they're so heavily traveled. That's a good analogy. British commentator William Barclay said it this way: it is a simple truth to say that the New Testament books became canonical because no one could stop them doing so. We can be confident that no other ancient books can compare with the New Testament in terms of the importance for Christian history or doctrine. When one studies the early history of the canon, one walks away convinced that the New Testament contains the best sources for the history of Jesus. Those who discerned the limits of the canon had a clear and balanced perspective of the gospel of Christ. Just read these other documents for yourself. They're written later than the 4 Gospels in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and even 6th century, long after Jesus, and they're generally quite banal. They carry names like the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Mary that are unrelated to their real authorship. On the other hand, the 4 Gospels in the New Testament were readily accepted with remarkable unanimity as being authentic in the story they told. Yet I knew that some liberal scholars, most notably members of the well-publicized Jesus Seminar, believed that the Gospel of Thomas ought to be elevated to equal status with the 4 traditional Gospels. Did this mysterious gospel fall victim to political wars within the church, eventually being excluded because of its unpopular doctrines? I decided I better probe Metzger on this point. The secret words of Jesus. Dr. Metzger, the Gospel of Thomas, which was among the Nag Hammadi documents found in Egypt in 1945, claims it contains the secret words which the living Jesus spoke, and Didymus, Judas Thomas, wrote down. Why was it excluded by the church? Metzger was thoroughly acquainted with the work. The Gospel of Thomas came to light in the 5th century copy. Let me say that again. The Gospel of Thomas came to light in a 5th century copy in Coptic, which I've translated into English, he said. It contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, but no narrative of what he did, and seems to have been written in Greek in Syria about 140 AD. In some cases, I think the gospel correctly reports what Jesus said with slight modifications. This was certainly an intriguing statement. Please elaborate, I said. For instance, in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus said, "A city built on a hill cannot be hidden." Here, the adjective, "a city built on a high hill," cannot be hidden. Here the adjective high is added, but the result reads like Matthew's gospel, or Jesus says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, render to God the things that are God's, render to me the things that are mine. In this case, the latter phrase has been added. However, there are some things in Thomas that are totally alien to the canonical gospels. Jesus says, split wood, I am there. Lift up a stone and you will find me there. That's pantheism. The idea that Jesus is coterminous with the substance of this world. That's contrary to anything in the canonical gospels. The Gospel of Thomas ends with the note saying, let Mary go away from us because women are not worthy of life. Jesus is quoted as saying, lo, I shall lead her in order to make her a male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who makes herself male will enter into the kingdom of heaven. Metzger's eyebrows shot up as if he were surprised at what he had just uttered. Now, this is not the Jesus we know from the 4 canonical gospels, he said emphatically. I asked, what about the charge that Thomas was purposefully excluded by church councils in some sort of conspiracy to silence it? That's just not historically accurate, came Metzger's response. What the synods and councils did in the 5th century and following was to ratify what already had been accepted by high and low Christians alike. It is not right to say that the Gospel of Thomas was excluded by some fiat in the part of a council. The right way to put it is the Gospel of Thomas excluded itself. It did not harmonize with other testimony about Jesus that early Christians accepted as trustworthy. So you would disagree with anyone who would try to elevate Thomas to the same status as that of the 4 Gospels, I asked. Yes, I would very much disagree. I think the early church exercised a judicious act in discarding it. To take it up now, it seems to me, would be to accept something that's less valid than the other Gospels, he replied. Now, don't get me wrong, I think the Gospel of Thomas is an interesting document, but it's mixed up with pantheistic and anti-feminist statements that certainly deserve to be given the left foot of fellowship, if you know what I mean. You have to understand that the canon was not the result of a series of contests involving church politics. The canon is rather the separation that came about because of the intuitive insight of Christian believers. They could hear the voice of the Good Shepherd in the Gospel of John. They could hear it only in a muffled and distorted way in the Gospel of Thomas, mixed in with a lot of other things. When the pronouncement was made about the canon, it merely ratified what the general sensitivity of the church had already determined. You see, the canon is a list of authoritative books more than it is an authoritative list of books. I'm going to say that again. The canon is a list of authoritative books. They had the authority before the authority picked them. So the list of canons is a list of authoritative books more than it is an authoritative list of books. These documents didn't derive their authority from being selected. Each one was authoritative before anyone gathered them together. The early church merely listened and sensed that these were authoritative accounts. For somebody now to say that the canon emerged only after councils and synods made these pronouncements would be like saying, let's get several academies of musicians to make a pronouncement that the music of Bach and Beethoven is wonderful. I would say thank you for nothing. We knew that before the pronouncement was made. We know it because of the sensitivity to what is good music and what is not. The same with the canon. Even so, I pointed out that in some New Testament books, notably James, Hebrews, and Revelation, were more slowly accepted into the canon than others. Should we therefore be suspicious of them, I asked. To my mind, that just shows how careful the early church was, he replied. They weren't gung-ho, sweeping in in every last document that happened to have anything about Jesus in it. This shows deliberation and careful analysis. Of course, even today, parts of the Syrian church refuse to accept the book of Revelation, yet the people belonging to that church are Christian believers. From my point of view, I accept the book of Revelation as a wonderful part of the scriptures. He shook his head. I think they impoverish themselves by not accepting it. The unraveled New Testament. Metzger had been persuasive. No serious doubts lingered concerning whether the New Testament's text had been reliably preserved for us through the centuries. One of Metzger's distinguished predecessors at Princeton Theological Seminary, Benjamin Warfield, who held 4 doctorates and taught systematic theology until his death in 1921, put it this way: if we compare the present state of the New Testament text with that of any other ancient writing, we must declare it to be marvelously correct. Such has been the care with which the New Testament has been copied, a care which has doubtless grown out of true reverence for its holy words. The New Testament is unrivaled among ancient writings in the purity of its text as actually transmitted and kept in use. In terms of which documents were accepted into the New Testament, generally there has never been any serious dispute about the authoritative nature of 20 of the New Testament's 27 books, from Matthew through Philemon, plus 1 Peter and 1 John. This, of course, includes the 4 Gospels that represent Jesus' biographies. The remaining 7 books, though questioned for a time by some early church leaders, were finally and fully recognized by the church generally, according to Geisler and Nix. As for the pseudepigraphia, the proliferation of Gospels, epistles, and apocalypses in the first few centuries after Jesus, including the Gospels of Nicodemus, Barnabas, Bartholomew, Andrew, the epistle of Paul to the Laodiceans, the apocalypse of Stephen, and others, they are fanciful and heretical, neither genuine nor valuable as a whole, and virtually no orthodox father, canon, or council considered them to be authoritative or deserving of inclusion in the New Testament. In fact, I accepted Metzger's challenge by reading many of them myself, compared with the careful, sober, precise eyewitness quality of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These works truly deserve the description they received from Eusebius, the early church historian: totally absurd and impious. They were too far removed from Jesus' ministry to contribute anything meaningful to my investigation, having been written as late as the 5th and 6th centuries, and their often mythical qualities disqualified them from being historically credible. With all that established, the time had arrived for my investigation to advance to its next phase. I was curious, how much evidence is there for this miracle-working first-century carpenter outside the Gospels? Do ancient historians confirm or contradict the New Testament's claims about his life, teachings, and miracles? I knew this required a trip to Ohio to visit one of the country's leading scholars in that field. As we stood, I thanked Dr. Metzger for his time and expertise. He smiled warmly and offered to walk me downstairs. I didn't want to consume any more of his Saturday afternoon, but my curiosity wouldn't let me leave Princeton without satisfying myself about one remaining issue. All these decades of scholarship, of study, of writing textbooks, of delving into the minutiae of the New Testament text, what has all this done to your personal faith? I asked. Oh, he said, sounding happy to discuss the topic, it has increased the basis of my personal faith to see the firmness with which these materials have come down to us, with the multiplicity of copies, some of which are very, very ancient. So I started to say, scholarship has not diluted your faith. He jumped in before I could finish my sentence. On the contrary, he stressed, it has built it. I've asked questions all my life. I've dug into the text. I've studied this thoroughly, and today I know with confidence that my trust in Jesus has been well placed. He paused while his eyes surveyed my face, then added for emphasis, very well placed. Deliberations, questions for reflection or group study. Having read the interview with Dr. Metzger, now how would you rate the reliability of the process by which the New Testament was transmitted to us? What are some reasons you find this process trustworthy or not? Scan a copy of the New Testament and examine some of the notes in the margins that talk about variant readings. What are some examples you find? How does the presence of these notations affect your understanding of the passages? Do the criteria for determining whether a document should be included in the New Testament seem reasonable? Why or why not? Are there other criteria you believe should be added? What disadvantages do modern scholars have in second-guessing the early church's decisions concerning whether a document should be included in the Bible? And those disadvantages would be that they're heretical and pantheistic. For further evidence, more resources on the topic, F.F. Bruce, The Canon of Scripture, from InterVarsity Press, 1988. Norman Geisler and William Nix, A General Introduction to the Bible, 1968. Chicago Moody Press, 1980. Reprint in Chicago Moody Press, 1980. Bruce M. Metzger, The Canon of the New Testament, Oxford, Clarendon Press, 1987, and The Text of the New Testament, New York Oxford University Press, 1992. Arthur G. Patzia, The Making of the New Testament, Downers Grove, Illinois, InterVarsity Press, 1995. Tomorrow we will go into the corroborating evidence. Is there credible evidence for Jesus outside of his biographies? This is Dr. Annette Feravich. We have been here for almost an hour reading chapter 3. Thanks so much for joining me here on Tuesday and Wednesday, where we read the case for Christ. And hopefully, since I was supposed to be getting it in yesterday, our Noah Trevor's book will be in for Thursday's reading. Thanks so much for joining me here in the classroom, where we are exiting now, day 355. On our first of 3 days back on after 4 days off. It is June 2nd here in the classroom, a beautiful sunny day here in Michigan. And I am Dr. Annette Feravich, always working to bring you a healthier examination of your mind, or a healthier boost in your mind, in your body, and in your spirit. Thanks for joining me.